Good morning, evening, or afternoon, everyone. Whenever you find yourself viewing this particular segment of Join the Movement Towards Racial Justice, I am so excited to be with you yet again as we move through this work, How to Be an Anti-Racist. You know, this is the third time, and I feel like it's going to come to an end and I'm going to miss each and every one of you. And so we move from chapters 7 through 11 to chapters 12 through 15. I am Dr. Renee K. Harrison, Associate Professor of African American and U.S. Religious History at the Howard University. Let's get started. Now, I find something to be quite interesting here, right? Kendi provides us several definitions in chapters 1 through 11. I'm going to go through the definitions here in chapters 12 through 15, but I want you to pay particular attention to what you see Kendi doing in chapters 12 through 15, right? Because in chapters 1 through 11, it's clear he's focused on a singular aspect of racism, but then in chapters 12 through 15, we see some layers start to emerge. So let's go. He talks about a class racist, one who is opposing racial capitalism. He talks about anti-racist, anti-capitalist, one who is making individuals responsible for the perceived behavior of racial groups and making racial groups responsible for the behavior of individuals. And then he goes on to talk about space racism. He calls it a powerful collection of racist policies that leads to resources inequity between racialized spaces or the elimination of certain racialized spaces, which are substantiated by racist ideas about racialized spaces. That is a mouthful. And then he goes on to talk about space anti-racist, a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to racial equity between integrated and protected racialized spaces, which are substantiated by racist ideas about racist spaces. Whoa, that's another mouthful. And then he talks about gender racism, a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequity between race genders and are substantiated by racist ideas about race genders. And then he goes on to talk about gender anti-racism. And earlier I said anti-racist. It should have been anti-racism when I talked about some of the other forms. But a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to equity between race genders and are substantiated by anti-racist ideas about race genders. And then he comes in the crescendo of crescendos as he moves towards sexuality. He talks about queer racism, a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequity between race sexualities and are substantiated by racist ideas about racist sexualities. And then he goes on to talk about queer anti-racism, a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to equity between race sexualities and are substantiated by anti-racist ideas about race sexualities. And there it is in a nutshell. I know that each time I give you a lot of definitions, I think it's important because he starts each chapter with a definition, which are key to how then he goes on to lay out his analysis and his memoir about his own experiences. But in this historical context, I want to talk about a word that came to mind for me as I moved through Kendi's chapters 12 through 15. But before I do that, I want to put a little of this in historical context about what he's actually doing here. So before I get to the word that comes to mind, I want to lay kind of a bit of a foundation, because in chapters 1 through 11, he talks about the singular forms of racialized oppression. But he does something different in chapters 12 through 15 when he talks about class, space, gender, and sexuality. What he does here, he expands his categories of forms of racism to name and confront, hear me, important here, the intersectionalities of racialized oppressions and inequity. I'll say it again. What he does here is expands his categories of forms of racism to name and confront the intersectionalities of racialized oppressions and inequity. That is, he looks at how race, class, gender, and space and sexuality oppressions often intersect, creating multi-layered discriminatory policies and inequity for people of color. And in so doing, it is important to note that such layers cannot be fully separated from the people who experience them. What does that mean then? A Black woman is faced with race oppression, but she's also faced with gender oppression because of her gender, her named or assigned gender by society, and even sometimes herself. But then he goes on and he does something here. He discusses the intersectionality of race and sexuality by describing queer racism, noting that homophobia and racism work together to intensify oppression. So I want you to think about the interlocking layers of that oppression when you think about a Black woman who is queer and poor, and she is residing within marginalized spaces in society, how the layers of that oppression becomes intensified because of the dimensions of the oppression by which she experiences via policies or discriminatory practices in the US. She's compounded by race, class, gender, space, and sexuality. Her oppression is compounded and intensified by the very nature of her race, class, gender, sexuality, and space. Now, Kendi's use of the term intersectionality he says himself is not something he coined, but draws on the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. And I want to quote something directly from Crenshaw herself, because I think the work that she does on intersectionality is just quite profound. And she uses that in 1989. She uses the phrase in her work, and you can look up some of her works. I'll name a few. One is Mapping the Margins of Intersectionality, Identity, Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. Another one of her works is Race, Reform, and Retrenchment, Transformation and Legitimization in Anti-Discrimination Law, and that's in the Harvard Law Review. And then the other one that's quite popular, it's Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist policies. And that is a part of the University of Law Legal Forum. That was written and also spoken in 1989. And what she says here, through an awareness of intersexuality, we can better acknowledge and ground the differences among us. And she goes on to say, while the intersection of race, gender, and class constitute the primary structural elements of the experience of many Black and Latino women in battering shelters, it is important to understand that there are other sites where structures of power intersect. For immigrant women, for example, Their status as immigrants can render them vulnerable in ways that are similarly coercive, yet not easily reducible to economic class. And so it's important here to see how the interlocking layers of oppression work on people of color at different spaces and different contexts within American society. Now, I want to say here that it's important to note, though Crenshaw has done noteworthy work on intersectionality, that she is not the first to use the term. We see this a term employed by Black feminists, especially in 1977, in the 1970s, late 1960s, where Black lesbian socialist feminists published a work called A Black Feminist Statement. And if you get a chance, you can look at that statement, but they delineate what it means to be a Black feminist within the context of a white world and within the context of a Black feminist world, Black male world. I mean, a white feminist world and a Black male world, what it means to carve out their own space as Black feminists. And it's unique because it talks about the various layers of oppression that people of color are impacted by. And it's not necessarily just a conversation around race. We have to integrate some of the other aspects of that oppression. But I want to also point you beyond them, because you will see during slavery, for example, Black women were often noted as saying, without using the term intersectionality, they were often noted as saying that as a Black woman, our bodies were always subjected to breeding and to being worked to the bone without pay. As one former enslaved woman, Black woman said, I was poor. I had nothing. I was Black. I was a woman. And all I ever known is work. All my life, all I ever known, she says, is work. Black women were clear about the intersectionality of these oppressions upon their Black bodies way back during slavery, during the creation of this great nation. So I said to you earlier, as I moved through Kendi's work, 1 through 11, and then now 12 through 15, I said earlier that I was going to talk to you about a word that comes to mind. And so this is important here as we come sort of to the end of his work before we get to the Juneteenth celebrations. I kept thinking about, as I'm reading through this, what is the call of this work for me, right? What is this work calling me to do? And so I thought a lot about a word that just kept coming to mind. And I'm going to say to you at some point, what word comes to mind for you? The word that came to mind for me was divestment. And if you can recall, in last segment's video 2, I left you with a question, and that question was, what do you need to divest yourself of in order to be an anti-racist? What are you willing to let go of? I posed that question to you, but I was also posing that question to myself. And so the word divestment kept coming up, and I thought about Gustavo Gutierrez. Get a chance to look up his work, born June 8th, 1929. He is a philosopher, theologian, and a priest, and he was honored as one of the founders of Latin American liberation theology. Now, what I find interesting, I'm not going to go into detail about Gutierrez's work, but what I find interesting in Gutierrez's work, he was really concerned about Jesus' message to the poor, and that the Christian gospel is a gospel that is designed for those that are in part of the Christian message is designed to ratify or deal with poverty, right? Those who are living in poor conditions. And so that meant for Gutierrez, right? That meant for him that he had to go through a series of divestment. He had to look at himself and say, in order for the policies that are affecting people of color and affecting poor people in Latin America, in order for me to be serious about the transformation of these policies, I had to go through a transformation of self. And that meant that in some ways he had to divest himself of some of the enrichments that he was experiencing and having by the larger dominant society in order to be in solidarity with the poor, to walk among them. And so this word divestment, I want you to look up Gutierrez's work. I don't want to get deep into that, but I want you to get a chance to see what he's saying and how what he is saying is connected to divestment. For me, it made me think about, as I read Kendi's work, what am I willing to let go of in order to move to the space of anti-racism? I started thinking about Gutierrez as a priest and a theologian who felt as though that he was benefiting from the larger society, from the dominant society, from the integration or the assimilation into society, and that there were poor among him, right? And in order to be in solidarity with the poor, he had to then go through some divestment. He had to give up something. He had to walk alongside them. He had to be committed to their cause, to their realities, because that realities is a direct result of a very capitalistic society, a very capitalistic American society that is built on and substantiated by materialism and by assets. And so it meant that in order for that society to operate, right, or the way in which that society operates, in a sense means that there's going to be a stratification. And so Gutierrez understood that he needed to divest himself of some of his enrichments and be in solidarity with the poor. And so as I read through Kendi's work, and I'm not arguing that Kendi is saying the same, what I'm thinking of is how liberation theology, how the idea of divestment relates to me. What is it that I'm willing to give up in order to be more conscious of the policies that are affecting people based on color, gender, class, space, culture, sexuality, religion, and so many other forms of oppression? What am I willing to divest myself of in order to be in solidarity and in order to work towards policies that are anti those things that I just named? It was a word that came to mind for me to do much deeper reflection about my engagement as a person in American society who at times practices racism. Now, having read chapters 12 through 15, I want to ask you, what word comes to mind for you? What word gets weaved like a quilt, like a thread in a quilt? What word gets weaved throughout this book that keeps coming to mind for you? And how is the word you selected connected to Kendi's work? And what is the connection asking of you on your anti-racist journey? I'm going to back up and do that again. Now, having read chapters 12 through 15, I want you to consider what word comes to mind for you. What word is woven like a thread in a quilt through Kendi's book? What word gets woven and comes to mind as you read this work? And how is the word you selected connected to Kendi's work? And what is the connection asking of you on your anti-racist journey? This is how I leave you with chapters 12 through 15 with this reflective question. As you journey towards racial justice, my word was divestment. I leave you with your word. And then we turn our attention on June 15th, 2023 to Juneteenth and to hear their word. Have a good day, everyone. It's been a pleasure. It's been a great ride. I hope you've had a great ride. I've had a great ride. See you on the webinar, June 15th, Juneteenth.